If there are very young children in the room with you watching 60 Minutes tonight, we caution you that this next story is not for them. But if you've got a teenage son there in the room with you, this is a story that you should watch together. It is about the cruel and unusual punishment a young man like your son may have to endure if he gets locked up. What we're talking about is prison rape. No one really knows the true number of those victimized, and no one bothers to count, but estimates range from less than 1% of prisoners to a staggering 12%. It is something prison officials are reluctant to talk about, but not former Justice Harry Blackmun, who said in a Supreme Court decision, the horrors experienced by many young inmates border on the unimaginable. Stephen Donaldson says that he was once one of the young inmates Justice Blackmun was talking about. Fresh out of the Navy, Donaldson had been arrested back in 1973 at the age of 27 for trespassing at the White House, where he was attending a Quaker pray-in protesting the Vietnam War. When he refused to post a $10 bail, Donaldson was jailed, and he says that he was gang raped repeatedly.
A bunch of guys grabbed me. About 8 of them squeezed into this little 2-man cell. And, they told me to strip my clothes off, and I refused to do that. And they grabbed me and started banging my head against the iron railing on the top bunk until I was dizzy, and then he started slapping me and hitting me in the face until I agreed to give in to them. They put a pillow over my head so that nobody could hear me screaming.
How many guys?
It was about 45.
What?
45 guys the first night, yeah. It started about 7 p.m. And about every 5 guys, they would move me on from one cell to the next. And I went down the whole tier, from the furthest away from the guard post, all the way down the tier.
Today, from his cramped New York City apartment, Donaldson runs Stop Prisoner Rape, an organization aimed at counseling inmates and educating the public about what can happen to inmates behind bars. Inmates like Chris Clugston. Clugston was 23 when he was sentenced in Florida to life in prison for murder.
When you arrive into the Rock, which is where I was at, you see people hanging out the windows that have big old muscles, veins popping out. They're all shouting cat calls and obscenities.
Like?
Choosing, fighting over who's going to be whose.
Chris says it wasn't long before someone chose him.
I was approached by 4 people, and I was raped repeatedly.
You plead with them?
Yeah, but that doesn't do no good.
Michael Robtoy says he too was sexually assaulted. But for Robtoy, it wasn't prison, it was in juvenile hall in California. At 16, Michael Robtoy, then a young, blonde, blue-eyed kid, was jailed after several residential robberies.
It took about 3, maybe 4 days after I got there before I was first approached. 3 inmates came into my cell, and I was physically assaulted and subsequently raped.
Why do men rape in prison? The experts say it's more about power than sex. The attitude is, look, I can dominate you, control you, degrade you. That it's a way to exert power when all other power has been taken away. The aggressor, the rapist, gains status in prison society. He's rarely, if ever, a homosexual, and the victim is, in many cases, heterosexual as well. Who's the most vulnerable target?
It's the nonviolent, first of all. The easy target's the nonviolent, the young, the first-timers who don't know what's going on in the system. They're fresh fish, and they attract sharks.
It can happen in a cell, in a shower, a day room, or in some dark corner of the cell block. It can be one-on-one, or it can be a brutal gang rape that leaves the victim beaten, physically and mentally.
It's a bad situation because there aren't any good options, but we recommend fighting if at all you can. Of course, if you're in a shower and you get surrounded by 6 guys with knives, fighting isn't going to do you any good.
How can this go on? How does this go on under the watchful eyes of prison guards? Various inmates we spoke with claim that some guards simply look the other way, ignore the problem completely. And Stephen Donaldson says that inmates from around the country tell him the same thing. You go to a guard, you go to a corrections officer, and you say, hey, this is what's going on. What did they say to you?
Mostly they'll say, take care of your own problems. Or they'll say, well, why don't you sit back and enjoy it? You know, they'll disbelieve it. Or if they don't do that,
they won't disbelieve it. I mean, they've got to know that it's going.
well, they'll tell you that we don't believe it. They'll say, where do you have any evidence?
Ron Angelone, head of Virginia's prison system, says that's not so.
99% of correctional officers would just look you right in the eye and say that is a lie. We don't treat the people that we're responsible for that way.
Angelone has spent more than 25 years in corrections in 7 different states. He acknowledges that rape is a problem in prison, but he says the guards can only do so much.
Many people have the perception that in prison, every inmate is being watched by a correctional officer 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. It's impossible to do that.
But what about the young man who needs protection most? The inmate who's unable to protect himself and is fearful. You're 21 years old or 23 years old, you haven't had a lot of experience, you've committed a crime, and you're scared to death. And suddenly, there you are in a cell with somebody.
Well, here we are treating adults like they're children, and this is what bothers me. These are the same people that brought fear and nightmare into somebody's life. They come to prison after causing whatever mayhem they caused, and all of a sudden now we want to say, look at this poor person. You must make all the decisions for them, and if you don't, then you're at fault, not them. These are adults. These are adult men. They need to come forward and say something that will help them protect themselves.
But in fact, victims of prison rape rarely come forward, rarely report the episode to prison authorities, and inmates say that if they do, it will not necessarily gain them protection.
In prison, if you tell on somebody, you're labeled a snitch, and you're subject to losing your life.
I was told that, you know, if I said anything, they'd kill me. I had already been severely beat up. So there was no doubt in my mind that, you know, they could make true of their threats.
The problem is the code of silence that inmates live by, that they will not say anything against a fellow inmate,
Right.
is the code that's hard to break. But individuals have to step forward.
But if doing it means I'm gonna be raped again, or I'm gonna get beaten up, in the final analysis, is it not the responsibility of the correction system itself, the prison itself?
It always is.
Unfortunately, most of the public doesn't care very much about the issue.
Dr. Helen Eigenberg teaches criminal justice and corrections at Eastern Kentucky University. Once she was a correctional officer herself.
We're in an era where it's lock them up and throw away the key, and so if they get raped, I think there's almost the underlying sentiment, well, good, maybe they won't come back to prison again if we make it awful enough.
If I have a young son who, either innocent or guilty, is going to be sent to the pokey, I can't imagine how a father would feel, or a mother would feel, about the possibility that his son is going to be fair game.
Well, I think that's why it's important to remember that a vast number of inmates who go to prison are there for drug offenses, for property offenses, that they're not all evil and mean people, and that they are real people who get victimized.
What's going to happen to all these guys when they get out? We put them back in the communities they came from, full of rage, convinced that their manhood has been taken from them, which is one of the big myths. And a lot of them feel that the only way they're going to get their manhood back is to be violent.
Michael Robtoy says he's a case in point. After being gang raped in juvenile hall, Robtoy says he received no counseling, and once released, he says he was overcome with shame and disgust.
I wasn't a man. They had taken my manhood from me.
Believing his attackers must have been homosexual, Robtoy says he went on a spree of homophobic violence that began at a carnival when he was approached and propositioned by a gay man.
I told him, let's go out back behind the trucks. And we was walking out there, and all the fear, disgust, and hatred was just boiling up inside of me. And when we got behind the trucks, I began to physically assault him. and I left him there laying in a pool of blood.
That violence continued and culminated almost a decade later in his killing a man, a murder that landed him back behind bars for life. Michael Robjoy believes that getting brutally gang raped back in juvenile hall turned him from a petty thief into a killer.
How many more Michael Robjoys are there going to be walking among the free world, seeking out?
But psychological trauma and violence are not the only potential consequences of prison rape.
We're no longer just talking about a sexual assault. What we're also talking about is the potential of transmission of AIDS.
AIDS can turn a 5 or 10-year sentence into a death sentence. In the last decade alone, AIDS deaths among inmates have increased by 1,300%. Today, there are more than 5,000 reported cases of AIDS inside prison walls. No one knows how many cases go unreported, because only a third of all U.S. prisons have mandatory HIV testing.
When everyone comes into the system, to start with, they should be tested for HIV. If they're found to be positive, they should have a separate prison for people that are HIV.
Why does Chris Clugston feel that way? Because he himself has been diagnosed HIV positive, the result, he believes, of those gang rapes. And worse, he says he shouldn't have been in prison to begin with.
I was innocent.
We hear that over and over from inmates, but in this case, the fact is that after Clugston had spent 11 years in prison for murder,
Yes, sir.
evidence finally did emerge that cast significant doubt on his guilt. So significant that last year, Clugston was granted clemency and was released.
Let me understand. You went to prison for murder you did not commit. You spent 10, 11 years in prison. You contracted HIV in a gang rape. You're out now, 35 years old, and what's your future?
They've taken everything, including my life, from me, and then I'm cut loose, I'm dying, I don't have anything. What is my future, Mike? I don't really have a future.
Is it conceivable, Director Angelone, that we are making too much of the incidents of rape in prison?
Absolutely not. New areas need to be addressed so that at some point we make it less and less. Nobody should be forced by someone else to have a sexual act committed against their will, especially while they're incarcerated.
Most people believe that people that are in prison deserve what they get. People just don't care. And that's the sad story. And that's what I would like people to see, is that they should care, because it could be you or your son that's in there next.